Good afternoon. Today is our third lecture on economics. The first was devoted to the history of trade and money, the process that resulted in the emergence of the current financial credit system precisely as an instrument of macroeconomic structuralist governance. The second lecture was devoted to the building of the balance equations, the input-output, intersectoral balance, and the principles of their governarial interpretation. Once again about the role of knowledge. Here are two posters of the 1920s, which explain simply and intelligibly the sources of the well-being of society, give reason to think about why it's necessary to engage in self-education. If we recognize that the country is going through a deep, protracted crisis, then the crisis cannot be resolved on the basis of the world understanding that gave rise to it. Dissatisfaction with life, if it exists, in itself is not cognizable, because it destroys what is, and who and how will create something new after that is always an open question. And there is no reason to believe that if there is no knowledge of how to cognize, what to cognize, then after what is broken, that everything will immediately be very good. Therefore, there is no need to rely on slogans, the authors of which say that everything is bad in the country, and that you just need to sweep away the existing regime, the existing socio-economic system, and then everything will be prettier for everyone. It will not get prettier. Also because what the economy is, how to govern it, neither the regime nor the opposition knows this. Last time we looked into the scheme. This diagram gives an envisionable idea of how the economy of the state functions. I repeat it, because those who watched the last lecture, in fact, may already have forgotten what was discussed, and some pictures, some formulas, need to be refreshed. Whether we like it or not, the economy can be represented in images as follows. The economy is a multisectoral production-consumption system. Next to all the arrows, you can write the capacity of product flows, the capacity of money flows, but nonetheless, if we draw it all correctly, we will not know what to do with it if we don't master the mathematical apparatus that describes this. The mathematical apparatus is the intersectoral balance equations. Last time I talked about how they are built, gave their governarial interpretation, principles of building governarial interpretation. Formula 3 must be remembered, and it must be understood that there is something in it, because without this, it is impossible to talk about economics. At a minimum, Formula 3 allows us to understand how sectors and regions are connected with each other. Formula 3 also allows us to understand how the micro level, that is, the level of separately considered enterprises, and the macro level, the economy as a whole, are connected with each other, as well as how the economy of the state is connected with the world economy. There are many hysterical questions about what the sufficiently general theory of governance is used for, who uses it, and how to use it. Everything further, this is the use of the sufficiently general theory of governance in relation to the biospheric-social-economic system and its component, the economy of the state, the macroeconomic system. Because if we return to this scheme here, then precisely this very system, which is shown in the scheme, acts as an object of governance. Well, the system of governance in this case is the state power itself, as well as the legislation on financial and economic activities as an instrument of state power, the standardization system that exists in society, well, and culture as a whole, since culture is an informational algorithmic system, and this means that culture, in some way, is oriented towards achieving certain objectives in certain ways along certain paths. And regardless of whether society understands this fact or not, culture, as an instrument of governance, works and leads society to what culture is programmed for. Therefore, the most reliable way to change the future is to change the culture of society so that it forms new generations in accordance with the tasks set by the programmers of culture. In the sufficiently general theory of governance, there is such a picture: structuring of information in the process of governance. The picture is actually simple. There are three vectors: the vector of objectives of governance, the vector of current state, and the vector of error of governance. The vector of objectives is what we want. The vector of state is what takes place. The vector of error is the difference between the one and the other. The methodology of the sufficiently general theory of governance assumes that if we have a vector of objectives of governance, then the dimensionality of the vector of state will always be greater than the dimensionality of the vector of objectives, because the vector of current state includes directly governed parameters that we can impact directly, and changes in these governed parameters will entail some changes in relation to those parameters that are included in the vector of objectives, in the vector of current state, in its main part. If, for us, the consequences of such an impact on directly governed parameters are predictable, then in this case, we can govern the process. If they are unpredictable, we cannot govern the process. Well, if from the whole plurality of parameters that characterize the object of governance and its interaction with the environment, we are not able to select those parameters by means of which we can govern the flow of the process, then we also cannot govern this process. This is a scheme for structuring of information. It is general, it is abstract. Now the same scheme, but applied to the multisectoral production-consumption system, which is presented here in this very scheme. The vector of objectives of governance is the wanted levels of production, import and consumption of all types of products necessary for the life and development of society and for ensuring the politics of the state. The vector of state is the available levels of production of all types of products, both those that are included in the vector of objectives and those types of products that are not included in the vector of objectives. But nonetheless, they are present in the system of product exchange, and being components of production-consumption, exert their impact on the economy in such a way that if they do not exist, then the objectives of governance are unattainable. The vectors of error of governance are the shortage of wanted products and the levels of production of unwanted products. In financial terms, the vector of error of governance is the price current for products consumed by the population in everyday life. I will not show again the picture with the graph of the price dependence on the volume of product supply, but nonetheless you should remember it. And if the volume of supply grows, then the price falls. This is market practice. Well, but if the volumes of supply are such that they guaranteedly cover all consumption demands, then at the macroeconomic level, there is no need for price as a means of restraining demand by financial solvency. But in order for this to be realized, a corresponding organization of the socio-economic system is required. If this socio-economic organization does not exist, then the very idea that the price current for products consumed by the population in everyday life is a financial expression through the vector of error of governance seems blasphemous, an encroachment on the principles of market liberalism. Further, there arises the question on the means of governance. It is clear that the means of structural governance are the architecture of bodies of state power, their functions, powers. It is also the architecture of the organizational staff structures of enterprises and associations of enterprises, the powers and interconnections of all bodies of governance at all levels, where reporting and governarial instructions are distributed in known ways to known certain addresses from known sources. The means of structureless governance are the system of standardization and certification of products, financial credit system, legislation and law enforcement practice. Since the system of standardization and certification of products belongs to the means of structureless governance, it must be understood that all regulatory bodies that are connected with this system have to be filled with people who know those things that they control from the inside. That is, from the standpoint of product design, organization of production, technological support, and from the standpoint of consumers of these products, because the consumer is interested in quality, and quality is conditioned by the set of requirements for the product, for the structure of the product, or its ingredient compositions, technologies, and technological disciplines. If the position of controllers is occupied by citizens who know no single thing in the design and technology of products, and don't understand how the quality of these products is evaluated by the consumer, and they can only correlate the reporting parameters with the requirements of any regulatory documents, then nothing good will come out of it, because these juridically minded idiots are going to bear a lot of stupidities. An example of this type of nonsense is given by academician Krylov in his memoirs. The Russian Navy had two battleships, St. Andrew the First called, and Imperator Pavel I. During the construction period of both, it was necessary to make engine frames. This is the foundation on which all the structural elements of the steam engine are formed. There were requirements for the metal from which the engine frame was to be produced. The metal, according to its mechanical characteristics, was supposed to be suitable for the range, the minimum loads and the maximum loads at which the sample was supposed to break. It turned out that the factory made the engine frames from higher quality metal, higher than the requirement of this range. The controller rejected, did not approve the engine frames, and it was necessary to intervene from the level of, at minimum, the Minister of the Navy, in order to approve these frames. At the same time, they fired the idiot official, who understood nothing about this. Therefore, it is not only about the mathematical models that describe the economy, but about those people who are involved in economic processes, how they understand these processes, and accordingly, how they behave in the course of economic activity. So the aforementioned things did happen. The structure of input-output balances in the cost form. Everything that was attributed to structuralist governance in the previous picture, here it falls into the column on the right, next to the table, because in order for the economy to function and provide products for the life of society, the development of society, state politics, financial circulation must be stable, and the sectors which produce everything that is necessary must each have, respectively, financial stability. The financial stability of sectors means that with the production of products in the volumes necessary for social development, all enterprises in the sector, maybe with the exception of the most technically backward and governarially illiterate ones, guaranteedly will not go bankrupt and will have the opportunity to develop. If their capacities are not enough, then they are able to absorb unsuccessful enterprises, modernize them, and either raise the required level of capacities or improve the quality of products. All these functionally conditioned costs, with a more detailed examination of the table, are the rows of block C, and accordingly, each row of block C must correspond to a column in the return in block B. And for each such pair, in the column in the return of block B, the main balance ratio must be observed. The cost of all factor costs corresponding to this row must be equal to the cost of the final product corresponding to this row in block B and forming a column in the return of block B. If this does not happen, then it turns out that either the products are not produced in the proper volume, or the products are produced in the proper volume, but for these products there is no financial solvent demand. Now look, the State Duma votes on the budget. If you correlate with this table, then what is the budget? This is the row of taxes in block C as a source of financing for this very budget, plus the incomes of state sector enterprises, their retained earnings. These are block components, partly of A, partly of C. If you change one line in the budget, what will it be like? This means that something will change in the return column in the final product, and you will find yourself before the necessity to recalculate the entire balance, having changed just one line in the budget. Well, as you understand, when the Duma votes on the budget and changes are made there, no one recalculates, for the simple reason that economics textbooks do not say a word about this. And the expert groups that serve the activities of the Duma, the government, the presidential administration, they are guided by any methodology, but not by a governarially consistent one. We also had this picture. We got acquainted with it. If you correlate this with the previous picture, then the saldo of taxes, grants, subsidies, is the eighth group. The eighth group is the topmost line between the solid bold and dashed one with two dots. Now let's see. If you increase the tax burden on a certain sector, then the entire height of the column corresponds to some extent to the output of the sector, and an increase in the tax burden is a widening of the line between FCLE, functionally conditioned levels of expenditures number 7, and FCLE 8. How can it be? It may be on account of the fact that FCLE 8 will become higher. If the volume of output is unchanged, then this means that prices for products will rise. If prices for products rise, then here is the question. Will there be enough solvent demand for these products to be sold because the price volume of supply is objective and does not depend on the fancies of the government and the tax department? Therefore, it may turn out that an increase in product prices, as a consequence of an increase in the tax burden, leads to the fact that some part of the product will not be sold. Therefore, the question of raising taxes leads to the fact that the price of products cannot be raised unlimitedly. And if the possibilities of raising the price have been exhausted, then, in order to pay all the required taxes, the sector must tighten all other expenditures that are lower than the tax burden. What can be tightened? In fact, one can tighten among the things below. Everything starting from the functionally conditioned expenditures of the second group and ending with the seventh group. It may turn out to be impossible to tighten the expenditures of maintaining current activities, because the current activities are primarily payment for the supply of products from other sectors. And if something can be reduced there, not to the end, then this is the salaries and bonuses of the personnel. If one correlates with the structure of the input-output balance, it turns out that as soon as you tighten the salaries and incomes of the personnel, the solvent demand of the people for certain types of products falls. And accordingly, some part of the products is not sold. If it is not sold, then the production of it is commercially unjustified. Further, the growth of unemployment, the shutdown of enterprises, and a wave of bankruptcies rolls across the national economic complex as a consequence of the fact that the exchange of goods is an objective given conditioned by technologies. What happened back then? They simply increased the tax burden on one of the sectors and did not see how the sector would react to it. Well, if the tax burden on all sectors has been increased, the same thing will happen. All this, in fact, is giggles, while we are considering the financial circulation in nominals. If we consider financial circulation in the model where there is always 100% of money in the financial credit system, and an emission is impossible, then the picture will look even worse. Because the question arises that if the tax burden grows and destroys the existing economy, then where does the money that comes as taxes go? Well, here we have to return to this very picture. There are many interesting things here, including the financial credit banking sector. Here it is also in some way reflected, although it in no way produces anything. And in reality it turns out that in the financial credit system, where there is always 100% of money, the banking sector will never be unprofitable, but solvent demand will be deformed according to it, and, correspondingly, a structural restructuring of the economy will take place according to this solvent demand. Therefore, financial circulation should be considered on the basis of a model in which there is always 100% of money in the financial credit system, and it's only expressed in some nominals. How many of these nominals should be, in what nominals this 100% will be expressed, these are already questions of emission and credit policy, which themselves are not related to the question of the input-output balance and balance models. What then is related? There is also such a thing, which is called the equilibrium price equation. Structurally, mathematically, it is similar to equation 3, but has a slightly different meaning. E is the same identity matrix. A is the same matrix of direct cost coefficients. T is the transposition sign. The transposition sign means that the cells of matrix A are transposed symmetrically to the main diagonal to other places. That is, if it was the 21st cell, Then, after the transposition, it will become the 22nd. To put it another way, the second cell of the first row of matrix A becomes the first cell of the second row of matrix A transposed. Vector P is the price current for the products that are included in the balance sheet. These are prices. R is a free term. This is a column vector of the shares of factor costs, shares of value added in the price of the products of sectors. That is, the components of vector R are determined by the ratio R-ith equals to V-ith divided by X-ith. X-ith is the gross output of the corresponding sector, and V-ith are these very V-ith ones, which are represented in block C. The equations have been known for a long time, since the middle of the 20th century. They are called the equilibrium price equation for the simple reason that if you substitute the corresponding value there, you can calculate the prices at which the balance converges. The question arises, if prices are set by the market, and prices are really set by the market, then what is this equation actually for? What is the use of it? If you calculate the prices on its basis, this is indeed a stupid thing if you don't set all prices in a directive addressing way, as was done by the USSR State Committee on Prices. But nonetheless, this equation is of interest if we say that everything related to block C is contained in a free column of the equilibrium price equation. That is, if we take the matrix of direct cost coefficients in the cost form, transpose it, take real market prices, then we can get the value of the components of block C in this very table. And accordingly, further, having received the value of the components of block C, we can build a tax grant policy, build a policy of income of the population, and thereby determine the financial climate, which should be oriented on ensuring that our macroeconomic system produces everything that we need. Therefore, the input-output balance equation, both in the form of product exchange and financial exchange, that is, in the form represented by equation 3, and the input-output balance equation in the form of the equilibrium price equation, are a certain instrumentarium that allows one to model the dynamics of the socio-economic system. Well, in the form in which I showed it to you, it allows you to understand what and how is connected in the economy, in the production sector, how the economy and its production sector are connected with the speculative sector, and how the economy, the financial system, is connected with the life of society, and has an impact on life, i.e., is an instrument of governance. I already once said that in the old days, I asked students studying in the specialty State and Municipal Governance to write an essay in the first lesson, where they had to present their vision on certain themes. One of the themes was economy as an object of governance. Shortly speaking, the majority of the group wrote that the economy is a subject of governance, on which everything depends, and it governs the life of society. Yes, it really can be so, but in one single case. If society is not the owner of this economy, and this economy is governed by someone else, in his own interests, but not in the interests of this society. In this case, the economy will not be a subject of governance, it will be an instrument of governance. But in order for the instrument of governance to work exactly in this quality, it is necessary that society itself be governarially illiterate, and that there be no politically active forces in it that are able to intelligently interpret balance models, and on this basis, understand what and how happens in this economy, and what needs to be done to make society live better from year to year. Because if we talk about what is happening in Russia, all references to the fact that the country is impacted by sanctions, the country is impacted by the consequences of the global financial economic crisis of 2008, is simply empty verbal fornication. But in reality, there exists an incompetent governance towards the macroeconomic system of the country. This incompetence is manipulated by quite competent foreign subjects who are solving the Russian question. And the economy operates in the mode of economic genocide of the country's indigenous population, which is again economically illiterate. Economic models, based on the instrumentarium of input-output balances, intersectoral, interregional balances, have been known for a long time, and Vasily Vasilyevich Leontiev was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1973 for this. But Vasily Vasilyevich worked in the USA and served, with his knowledge, the capitalist system, the oligarchic capitalist system. At the same time, on the basis of balance models, somehow interpreting them, the State Planning Commission worked in the Soviet Union and solved different tasks, because the mathematical apparatus itself is neutral. Mathematical models allow one to solve one of two tasks. The first task is simple. There is an oligarchy, and the oligarchy poses the simple question: how should the economy work in order for us to have everything, and the number of humanoid draft animals should be minimal, and the costs of its maintenance and reproduction should also be minimal. So the balance models allow us to answer this question. But if we recall the main problem of civilization, and the main problem of civilization is that man is purely a biologically herd-pack monkey with low innate morality, with a morality in which everything is acceptable in intraspecific competition. Then, as man develops civilization, its technosphere, he ceases to be a weakly armed species, and loses the right to this low morality of a herd-pack monkey. And accordingly, if the balance models are used in the mode of solving the task, the oligarchy will provide for itself everything that it desires with a minimum cost of maintaining the reproduction of humanoid draft animals. Then this civilization will cease to exist in the foreseeable historical prospects. And accordingly, the question arises of how the objective laws, in accordance with which the civilization should live, can be reflected in these very balance models. Here's another slide. This is a piece of the presentation. At the bottom there is a picture that I have shown several times. These are objective laws to which the life of human society is subordinate, regardless of whether people are aware of these laws or not. The objective laws can be attributed to one of 6 groups. The pan-biospheric group, which regulate the formation of biocenoses and the interaction of biological species with each other, and the biosphere as a whole with the natural environment. Species-specific ones, which are characteristic of the biological species Homo sapiens, and which distinguish it from other biological species. Noospheric religious subjective laws, which by their nature are nravious ethical, and regulate the mutual understanding of carriers of reason. And these objective laws, from the point of view of the carrier of the atheistic and materialistic worldviews, they do not exist. But nonetheless, the mysticism connected with them happens in life, and materialists are forced to wonder as to why someone is chronically unlucky, but someone else is chronically lucky. Further, socio-cultural objective laws that govern the building of culture and its consequences. Economic objective laws regulate the economic activity of people and predetermine its consequences for economic systems as such and for society as a whole. And also, since the organizational technological complex impacts the natural environment, then economic activity generates a certain impact to which reacts the planet's noosphere, as well as the natural environment. And there is also a reciprocal impact of the natural environment on our economic activities. Well, since all this does not automatically harmonize itself, it must be governed. And there are governarial objective laws. We are now considering a very narrow theme. Economics. This is the 5th group of objective laws, and models connected with them, which in one way or another reflect them, or contradict them. Now let's look at the question that the initial balance equation allows us to say. If vector f is given, what should vector x be like? Because if we have certain technologies, then we can get the wanted final product, only if the gross capacities of the sectors allow us. It turns out that balance models themselves do not answer the question of how to set this vector f, but we have the right to set it only so that the objective laws of all these 6 groups do not destroy the life of society, do not oppress every one of the people in response to our economic activity, that is, to production and in response to our consumption. And then questions arise about how the economic activity in society, the production of products, the distribution of products, and the consumption of products should be organized. We have already discussed this picture more than once, but we discussed it in connection with other questions. And now we will touch upon it in relation to the questions of economic activity and governance towards it. In every region that has a physical and geographical peculiarity, an objective limiter for the life of civilization is a certain structure of land use. Back in the 1970s of the last century, studying the question of the interaction of the civilization of the planet's biosphere, the Greek architect Konstantinos Doxiadis came to the conclusion that something like this is needed. 40% are reserved lands, where there will never be anyone except the staff of the reserves, and there can be no excursions on a schedule. 42% are lands where there are natural biocenoses characteristic of the corresponding regions, and where a person can appear on his own initiative, where he can rest, but he should not conduct systematic economic activity there. 10.5% are agricultural lands, 7.3% are residential areas, and 0.2% are harsh industrial landscapes such as steel plants, landfills for processing the waste of civilization, where no natural biocenoses can exist. Since we don't have levitation technologies, and what in science fiction is called zero transportation, we need all sorts of infrastructures, which also in some way run across the territories and must fit into this restrictive land use structure. Then the biospheric ecological policy of the state is worked out. Further, the infrastructural and demographic policy of the state, which should be in line with the biospheric ecological policy, is worked out. The implementation of this policy, presented in Block 3 and Block 2, requires economic support. The economic support modeled by balance models is first of all the task of column vector f, the vector of the final product. And this is one of the actions that lies inside Block 4 in this picture. Further, we run into problematics that are not solvable if we don't master the apparatus of mathematical statistics and probability theory, because there are purely political tasks that the state solves. The state acts as a consumer and says, "I want." This "I want" is expressed in the fact that the state wants ships, aircraft, other military equipment, a basing system. There are citizens who also say "I want." In other words, as a result, a certain set of needs arises. Part of the needs can be satisfied by the fact that we take something straight from nature with minimal labor. We go to the forest, collect mushrooms and cook them. But some things require more labor, because if a trip to collect mushrooms can be qualified as a walk, that is, a rest, then, as the Russian proverb goes, without labor, you can't catch a fish from the pond. There is a certain production in order to satisfy the needs. As a result of certain activity, the need is satisfied, and the satisfaction of needs entails the consequences of its satisfaction. For example, there was such information that when in the second half of the 50s, early 60s, the Japanese launched the production of chicken according to the American broiler technologies, their statistics of diabetes mellitus sharply climbed. These are the consequences of the satisfaction of the need for chicken according to the US broiler technologies. It is also known that the Americans are not the healthiest group of the population in the global civilization. That is, the consequences of satisfying needs can be both good and not very good, or they can be simply harmful. The same applies to the consequences of production, because if, for example, there is an aluminium plant, and there is a lot of territory around it where there are sedimentation tanks for all kinds of sludge, then this is also hardly useful for the biosphere of the planet and the population that lives in this area. And if our genius government decides to exterminate Sosnovsky hogweed with pesticides, then we must understand that they will flood the entire territory with pesticides, and this will cause extremely negative consequences for the health of other biological species, including those with which the population is connected by trophic chains in the biosphere. Therefore, this chain, need, production in its provision, then the fork, the consequences of production, and satisfaction of the need and consequences of its satisfaction, this is what sociological science has to analyze. But it should not be engaged in studying the question, what is the rating of the United Russia Party? Because if United Russia Party does not want to know anything about the economy or about the methods of how to satisfy needs, their consequences, then the rating of United Russia, as well as the rating of the entire statehood, which is unable to ensure the quality of governance, will fall. If we analyze this here, it turns out that all needs can be divided into two classes. The first one, demographically conditioned needs, form the first group. Satisfaction of demographically conditioned needs is safe for human health, and safe for the biosphere as a whole, for those territories where production takes place to satisfy them and where products are consumed. At least the biosphere is able to compensate for the damage that is done to it, faster than this damage is reproduced. In demographically conditioned needs, there may also be a group that ambiguously belongs to demographically conditioned needs. That is, if the volumes of consumption lie in a certain fork, from a certain maximum to a certain minimum, then these are demographically conditioned needs. If they fall outside these limits to a greater or lesser extent, then they harm, and accordingly, cease to be demographically conditioned, the satisfaction of which is necessary to ensure the life of society, its development in harmony with nature. Therefore, there arises the second class, degradational parasitic needs. Their satisfaction harms directly or indirectly both the consumers themselves and the surrounding descendants of the biosphere. But some of the needs turn out to be wandering from one group to the other, depending on the extent to which they are satisfied or not satisfied. And accordingly, it turns out that for vector F, the satisfaction of demographically conditioned needs, in the cyclics of solving these tasks, is a necessary norm, and the economy has to work to ensure that demographically conditioned needs are guaranteedly fully satisfied. Therefore, talking about economic growth without dividing all the needs, and all those taken into account in the statistics of production and consumption groups, into demographically conditioned, degradational parasitic needs, is to fall into idiocy. For example, a few years ago, the European Union considered it a blessing to take into account the income from prostitution and drug trafficking in the national income. As a result, Greece's national income immediately rose by 2%. Was it good for Greece? Hardly good. The questions of demographically conditioned needs and degradational parasitic needs are not a question of disputes of nerves. It is a question of analyzing the interconnections of statistics that characterize the life of society. It is a question of the conditionality of each of these statistics by the objective laws of all six groups. And then, in fact, it turns out that if we are conducting this analysis, then two spectra of needs are conditioned, and we must attribute degradational parasitic needs to the vector of error of governance, and the vector of objectives of governance has to absorb into itself the demographically conditioned needs. This is one of the fragments of the picture, the cyclics of tasks of state governance. It is in the lower right corner. And this is the fragment that is taken from there. What is on it? First, there is such a thing known as the demographic pyramid. It is a demographic pyramid on condition that we think in static states that don't have internal dynamics and discretely replace each other like frames in a film strip. If we think in processes, then we don't like the demographic pyramid, we connect it with the chronological axis, and we get a demographic wave. If the state has a demographic policy then the demographic wave is predictable. It's predictable for decades and centuries ahead. If, in the present and reliable past, the demographic wave can be known to us from the relevant sociological studies, and it's reliable, then in relation to the future, the demographic wave is predictable. The demographic pyramid, the demographic wave, whatever you call it, is very informative. Some aspects are shown here: age groups that are labor resources. Here the section lining of the labor resources is presented before the carrying out in our country of the pension reform, as a result of which the retirement age was raised. Further, the birth rate statistics may be connected with the demographic pyramid, and it too can be prolonged into the future in some variability. But the main thing is something else. The structure of social needs, demographically conditioned needs, is connected with the demographic wave. And all demographically conditioned needs can be divided into three groups. Personal needs. The volume of their satisfaction is proportional to the size of the corresponding population groups, taking into account the sex and age. To put it differently, if, for example, 1,000 children have been born in a certain region this year, then you know the amount of clothes needed for little girls, the amount of clothes needed for little boys, how many pediatricians are required to ensure that all children are under medical supervision and that doctors do not work from dawn to dawn on 3 shifts. Everything here can be counted. Next, you figure out how many vacant places are required in schools, how many jobs will be required in 18 years, vacant places in systems of higher professional education. The second group of needs is family needs. The volume of production for their satisfaction is conditioned by the number of families. If you have a typology of families, and this typology corresponds to reality, but not to the wants of the governing party that states that there are no poor pensioners in our country, since all pensioners are paid extra according to the subsistence level, then family needs are also predictable on the basis of the demographic wave. Well, since we live on the basis of infrastructures, and these infrastructures exist both in rural areas and in urban areas, accordingly there are infrastructural needs, and these needs are predictable in the future for decades and centuries ahead. That is, we know how vector f will change in the future. As for the eradication of degradational parasitic needs, this is not an economic task as such. Yes, we are forced to take degradational parasitic needs into account in the balance as an objective reality, because we cannot overnight eliminate the production of tobacco and alcohol, because our culture is defective and there is a demand for these products. This demand will not disappear until the culture changes. But nonetheless, it is inappropriate to take this and other degradational parasitic things into account in the structure of the national income. Next, let's turn to this picture. This picture characterizes one of the sectors as a source of goods for the satisfaction of some of the needs of people. The horizontal axis is the chronological axis. On it, time is marked. Time in this case is a sequence of delta t intervals. For each delta t interval, we have a certain intersectoral balance. In addition, the line of bold dotted lines is a prognosis of the dynamics of need for products of the considered by us sector I. That is, if we have n sectors, then we should have such drawings by the number of sectors n, and these needs in some way change over time. On the first interval delta t, we have a limiter, an evaluation of the limit of production possibilities for this need. And there is a continuous broken line. This is the dynamics of real production on the basis of the plan, described by the input-output balance for each of the time intervals. And there is the dynamics of the vector of objectives of governance towards production. In other words, this is what we set into the plan. And now note that the dynamics of the vector of objectives of governance towards production is lower than the dynamics of real production in accordance with the plan. The dynamics of real production in accordance with the plan over time catches up with the dynamics of need for products in this sector. This is exactly what the ratio of plans of reality and needs should be. The situation may arise that production capacities for guaranteed satisfaction of needs for any product are clearly not enough. The Soviet planning system was oriented towards the so-called tensioned plans. That is, the State Planning Commission evaluated the production possibilities to the maximum and, based on these evaluations, planned the further development of production. As a result, such situations arose that they could not really reach the obviously over-evaluated plan of the sector, and accordingly, they generated deceptive reporting on the implementation of the plan or fulfilled the plan by reducing the quality of products. This was the result of governarial ignorance and erroneous understanding of the purpose of the entire planning system. The tasks of planning are not to say with precision to the smallest detail what there will be in 5 years or 10 years. The tasks of planning are to set guaranteedly those levels of production below which the real production will never fall with proper governance. And this is reflected in this picture. The thin solid broken line is the dynamics of the vector of objectives of governance towards production. It presupposes non-tensioned planning. That is, the production capacity must allow to knowingly fulfill these plans. If we don't have enough production capacity, then in vector F, we have a column investment products. What investment products will be in the long term is an open question, since this is a question of scientific technological progress, its concretics. But the availability of investment products presupposes investment costs in the structure of factor costs of enterprises. And if the development of the sector requires a certain level of these costs, then they should be. Further, it turns out that the system of organizing the economy as a whole should be built in such a way that enterprises are interested in scientific technological progress and the implementation of the achievements of scientific technological progress in the practice of their activities. This theme is not economic. This is the theme of introducing scientific implementational cycles, and I talked about this in one of the lectures on biospheric-social-economic systems as objects of governance before moving specifically to the country's economy. If there is scientific technological progress, if the plans are not tensioned, with adequate governance towards the tax grant subsidy balance, the economy will develop as a sequence of stages described by intersectoral balances, and it will gradually reach a level that allows guaranteed satisfaction of demographically conditioned needs. If you look at this picture, then this is an analog of the task of hitting a homing missile of a slowly maneuvering air target. Since the mid-1950s, this task in the space of parameters with a dimension of 3 has been successfully solved in the interests of the country's air defense and anti-missile defense, as well as anti-submarine defense. That is, there is nothing fundamentally new here, except that it's required to solve the task in the space of parameters in a larger dimensionality, namely in the space of parameters depending on how many sectors in the national economy you select. 20 means 20, 40 means 40. But, on the other hand, you don't need to solve this task within a minute. You can calculate plans for the next 5-year plan within at least several years preceding the next 5-year plan, while the current 5-year plan lasts. There is one circumstance here, because regardless of whether you are planning in physical accounting or in cost accounting, the essence of the matter does not change. You have set production levels for sectors that are obviously attainable for them, provided them with raw materials, production capacities, labor resources of the necessary qualifications. But the financial credit system, at the same time, acts as an instrument of structureless governance towards the production and distribution of products. And this means that even if you produce everything in the quantities necessary for society, if there is no solvent demand, then there will be big problems. And the governance towards solvent demand is a financial instrumentarium that is either prescribed in the legislation or is absent as such. and even if it is prescribed in the legislation, but you have not prepared governors who know how to use it, nothing good will come out of it. To put it another way, you can plan all this here. It will be attainable in principle, but it may fail if at the fifth stage of the Cyclics economic activity, in line with the plans of biospheric ecological and socio-economic development, it loses financial stability. It can lose financial stability due to the fact that the needs of people are really satisfied, the deficiency of products is exhausted, as a result of which the price of products falls below the threshold of profitability of its production. If this happens, then the corresponding sectors will lose financial stability. In them, there begins a reduction of production volumes, reaching bankruptcies, an emergence of an economically surplus population. This is the norm for a bourgeois liberal economy, genocide of this population, and other social problems. Therefore, it turns out that in order for such a long-term policy to be guaranteedly in satisfying demographically conditioned needs and developing society on this basis, realizable, an instrumentarium is required to protect the solvent demand of sectors and final consumers from what in Western psychology is called Maslow's pyramid. Maslow's pyramid is an unequal priority ranking of needs. And it turns out that if the dynamics of production is faster than the dynamics of psychological changes, Ravious ethical changes in society, then Maslow's pyramid will lead to the fact that there will be an outstripping rise in prices for higher priority products. And accordingly, the profitability of what is necessary for social development will be nothing or will leave much to be desired. Therefore, the fifth block in this Cyclics involves state correcting, pricing, and protecting of solvent demand. Everything that concerns the protection of solvent demand is subsidies to consumers, both in the sphere of production and in consumption, personally addressedly for certain objectives and tasks. In this case, the insufficient financial solvency of consumers allows them to buy those products, the production of which is profitable, and the prices for which, in fact, are quite high. The second task is to govern profitability thresholds. That is, if prices for products of any sector fall below the profitability threshold, or threaten to fall below it, then grants to the producer of these types of products should ensure its profitability. And here we are confronted with the prejudice, cultivated by market liberals, that grants and subsidies are a waste of money, that everyone has to pay for himself. If he himself cannot pay, then objective economic laws, they say, are fair, and so it should be this way. But if we proceed from the assumption that the owner of the financial credit system is the state for the whole people, but not for an elite corporate oligarchy, then all other physical and legal entities are users of this financial credit system. And if they are users of the financial credit system, then they must play by the rules dictated by the state. If they don't like it, then please go to another state where the rules for using the financial credit system are different. And if we understand that in the financial credit system there is always 100% of money, which is only expressed in some denominations, then this means that grants and subsidies can be paid on account of the fact that in some sectors, in some social groups, super profits are cut off. Super profits that cannot be realized within the framework of demographically conditioned consumption, but which can be the source of all kinds of degradational parasitic consumption. Moreover, please note that such an approach does not in any way infringe on the freedom of private entrepreneurship, because if you see that some products, corresponding to the demographically conditioned spectrum of needs, are not enough in society, then invest there, organize production, and even if prices fall below the threshold of profitability, your production will be supported in one way or another, either by tax subsidies or by a grant mechanism. Moreover, here it is necessary to pay attention to one more such governarially important thing: retained earnings. They should always be present in any sector with a competent governarial approach. But the question is, what should it be like in a particular sector? If the economy functions stably, then there should be some more or less stable level of retained earnings. And if we monitor in the economy that the level of retained earnings is falling, in this picture, retained earnings, this is the line between the 7th and 6th levels, then this means that the sector is approaching the threshold of loss of financial stability. And accordingly, either producers of products in this sector need grants, or consumers of products in this sector should be supported by subsidies so that they can ensure the financial stability of the sectors. In general, this is the basis of what is required in the future in order to be able to use balanced models to govern the country's economy and provide economic support for the biospheric-social-economic development of our society. Once again, the whole multisectoral production-consumption system has value for society, but not some kind of enterprise, even the most advanced one that fits into it. And the only question is the economic politics of the state aimed at the fact that this system functions in the interests of society, or has the state lost its sovereignty, and some sectors and productions in this system are destroyed by one means or another, foreign political subjects, and some sectors and productions fit into the world economy, and the country as a whole, its population, is seen as one of the many economic resources in the world economy, which does not belong to humanity at all, but to some transnational elite corporate grouping. In order for this picture to reflect reality, dynamic balance models are required, in which the increase in gross capacity is a certain function of the spectrum of investment product and the spectrum of investment expenditures of sectors. You must understand that the building of such models is serious research and development work, which must be carried out by the appropriate teams. The higher school of economics will not be able to cope with this task, because it serves a liberal economic market model in which the country's population is humanoid working cattle, one of many economic resources. The Communist Party of the Russian Federation and the oligarchs who support it also shy away from this task. The reasons are the same. The Communist Party of the Russian Federation is a party that parasitizes on the ideas of communism and social previousness. Therefore, life in a socially oriented planned economy, in which there is directive addressed governance towards production in the state sector and in concerns, and there is structureless governance based on market self-regulation and adjustment of the market to implement plans for biospheric social economic development, this is that cultural feat that our society must conduct. That's it for today. If there was something unclear in the last 3 lectures, watch more lectures from the Baltic State University on the same theme, and read the book Economics of Innovative Development, Publishing House Conceptual. Everything is described in detail.